Okay, so we are now recording. Hi, welcome again to the Beyond CRAAP webinar, and I am going to turn it over to our presenters.
I'm Frank Lambert. I'm an assistant professor and program coordinator of the Masters of Library Science program at Middle Tennessee State University in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
And I'm Mary Thill. I am the reference coordinator and the humanities librarian at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago.
And I'm James Rosenzweig. I'm the education librarian at Eastern Washington University, which is in Cheney, Washington, just outside of Spokane, Washington. Welcome, everybody. We have a presentation for you today. Our hope is to take about the first 35 to 40 minutes to present some things to you, and then to leave plenty of time there at the end, 20-25 minutes for us to engage in a Q&A. As things go, if you want to leave questions in the chat in Zoom, we'll start by addressing some of those questions that sort of bubbled up during the presentation before moving on to whatever sort of live questions you've got at the very end. In the chat, I have posted something that links to several handouts we'll be making reference to over the course of the presentation. They're generally speaking in order. This was already sent out, and so you may have all that information already, but that's just there for your convenience. Well, I'm just going to talk for just a couple of minutes here at the start to explain why we're called Beyond CRAAP and what it is we have to say about source evaluation, starting with sort of the CRAAP test. Several years ago, when this project started, we were interested in evaluating sources, and obviously the test we were most familiar with for students is the CRAAP test, which we had taught before, and many of you probably, maybe even all of you, have used before working with students. When we went to look at it to make use of it, we realized that it had some strengths, but those strengths were weaknesses also. It relies a lot on some subjective impressions, and particularly for novice researchers, like high school students transitioning into college, the question of whether or not they can assess how accurate something is, or relying on their own background knowledge, which may be very limited about the subject, we had some concerns that it just would be very difficult to apply in a consistent way. And there wasn't much research to suggest that it had that kind of consistency and validity that we were looking for. Also, one of the A's in CRAAP is authority, but the ACRL's Framework for Information Literacy had just come out, placing a much more clear emphasis on authority and helping students develop an understanding that authority is constructed and contextual. So what we did, the reason that we moved away from the CRAAP test, was to go looking for something that we thought could get at those things more effectively. We found a taxonomy published by some researchers at Michigan, Leader, Markey, and Yackel, that we realized had a lot of strengths. It focused on really neutral description of attributes. It wasn't tied to formats. It was more interested in the sort of people involved in the production of information material. And it really lowered the expectations on novice researchers to understand the field, and placed a lot of focus on just understanding the pieces that come together to make authority. And so that was our feeling, that what we need to do, because of the framework, and also because students, especially the students we're talking about here, right, who are moving from the K-12 system into the collegiate system, students have been accustomed to searching sources that they've been told are authoritative, right? Their teachers have said, use these sources for this assignment. That's very common, right? Especially in the younger grades. This is the age in which students need to develop that understanding for themselves, to be successful in college, also just to be citizens and independent adults, right? And so our feeling is that our model is going to be useful in an academic setting, but it's also really flexible to be useful in a sort of lifelong learner setting. So that students can become the people we need them to be. And that's the point of the framework, I think. So having said that as a sort of preface, Mary is going to talk a bit about just what our method is.
Great. So right now I'm going to be talking about the Y method, and there's a handout that is available. It's in the chat. It's available through our website. This is a handout that you can use with your students in the classroom. That's primarily how we designed it. But I want to talk you through the Y method a little bit. So, so in the Y method, what we're doing is we're asking students to evaluate the resources that they find according to 3 criteria: authorship, editorial process, and publication purpose. And I want to say a little bit about each of those categories. So the first category is authorship. And so we ask students to say, who is the author? That's the W, right? And particularly, how is the author qualified to write about the topic at hand? So what we do is we have students look at author credentials to determine whether individuals are qualified to write on a given topic. And credentials include both educational credentials as well as professional experience. Usually we tend to value graduate credentials above undergraduate credentials, unless we're talking about the field of journalism, where we will accept an undergraduate degree in journalism as sort of proof of a background in journalism. Students have to evaluate the credentials in context. They need to learn that an impressive academic credential in one setting isn't very helpful in a completely different setting. And if you look at the handout, you'll see there's this category called academic amateur. That's a great example of this point. An academic amateur is for authors with a graduate degree in one field, but they're an amateur in the field that's being written about. And I think we see this very often where, there'll be maybe like even popular celebrities, academic celebrities, right, who sort of have opinions about things that are really beyond their field of expertise, but they love to bring out that PhD or to bring out that MD. Also, sometimes there are going to be multiple individual authors who are co-authoring a piece. We would like to indicate that students should focus on the most credentialed person in that group when they're trying to determine who is the author. Now we lump all corporate authors together. If you use the MLA formatting style, right, we tell them, there is such a thing as a corporate author. Our method also has a corporate author category, and that's to teach students that when an organization is the author, it's really important to examine that function, the function of the organization. And so that's why we have sort of the three categories. We're always using those three categories together. So the second category is the H, how was it edited? Many of our students haven't heard much about the different kinds of editorial processes. At least that's been our experience. And if they have, maybe they've only really heard about peer review from their librarians and from their teachers. But the Y method prepares students to interact with all kinds of resources, including those that they find on the web. So our method has descriptions of other kinds of review processes. For instance, there is a category for professionally reviewed sources. Now, these are most often produced in traditional newsrooms, but sometimes professionally reviewed sources can include medical information, for instance, that's reviewed by a team of named physicians. It could be information on library science that's been edited by a team of librarians. The important part is, again, that the students are always sort of reviewing in context the credentials of their editors. We also have a category for non-professionally reviewed sources. I think this is probably one of the most important categories in the method. Websites are constantly posting information by named authors without going into detail about their editorial process, or they're having unqualified, uncredentialed editors do the job. So they'll give somebody the title of editor, but it really doesn't mean anything. This person doesn't have a professional advanced degree in that area, or they don't have any journalistic background. So we think it's really a helpful life skill for students to begin to recognize non-professionally reviewed sources. There's also a category for self-published resources. One great thing about the web is that it's made it easier for organizations and individuals to publish information for themselves. And some self-published resources are really good and important, right? The US government is a great example, right? We really do rely on some of that data. But other self-published resources aren't so good. And so students need to learn that when they're dealing with something that's self-published, they really do need to rely on the credentials of the author, as well as the purpose of the publication to sort of make a determination on whether or not that source is authoritative. And finally, the last point is, why was this published? Get it, letter Y. So that's the purpose of the publication. Understanding the purpose of why something was published is really important to determining the authority of a source. The reality is that our students are going to encounter sources that are not academic. And at the same time, also sometimes they're going to encounter things that were written for a higher education purpose, but maybe they're not written by people who are credentialed in the field, or maybe there wasn't a very rigorous editorial process. So, so that's why we think that these different elements are really important to use together, and in the classroom we want to be sure to talk about these three elements together. Now, just a couple of concluding thoughts. This seems like it's very cut and dry, but when we have used it in our own research, sometimes the members of our research team have disagreed about whether a particular academic credential was relevant to the topic being written about, or whether let's say a freelancer had enough experience to qualify as a journalist. And we think that that's okay. As you'll see when James walks you through a sample classroom exercise in a little bit, that these fuzzy areas are actually really good opportunities for enriching classroom discussion. And they're a chance for us to guide our students into being more sophisticated information consumers. At the same time, if you do want to sort of get into sort of the finer points of the taxonomy, on our website, we do have like more explicit instructions for like what qualifies as a journalist. We've made some demarcations there. For you all, but you don't necessarily need to make those for the classroom. So before I turn it over to Frank, who's going to go next and talk a little bit about our research, I want to take a moment first of all to practice using the why method ourselves. So everybody bear with me. I've made a Kahoot quiz, and now it's time for the Kahoot quiz. So here we go. I'm going to try and share my video. We'll play this game. And James, will you give me the thumbs up if it's working okay? Okay, thanks. Here we go. Oh, not give me the thumbs up, but he's bouncing, so. All right, so please join us in the Kahoot. And don't worry, like they are recording points, but we're all friends here. SpongeBob. Okay, I think I'm going to get started now. You can always join us later or play from home. All right, so our first question is a true or false question. Was the book Gender, Psychology, and Justice quoted in a real student paper that we collected in 2019? True or false? Blue is true, red is false. All right, we're getting the hang of this. Just a few more. All right, so we'll skip ahead to the answer. Okay, yes, this was a real book that was quoted in a student paper. So we're going to go and see how the student would have evaluated this resource based on the why method. Oh, and look, here's our scoreboard. Of course, Hufflepuff is in the lead. Okay, so who was the author, right? So we're gonna, based on what's on the sheet, we're gonna determine the credentials of the author. So this is Dean John Schwartz. He has a PhD in psychology Psychology, and he is the Associate Dean at the University of Houston. And remember, this is a book on psychology. All right, we're going to skip ahead to the answer. All right, so most of you were correct. He's an academic. He has a PhD in the field being written about, because this is a book in psychology. I can understand why you might think that he's a professional or a journalist or an academic amateur, but in fact, he's writing in the topic that's being written about, or at least that was our opinion. Maybe you have a higher set of standards for what qualifies as a credential in that area. All right, next one. Oh man, Hufflepuff, still in the lead. My daughter's in the House of Gryffindor. I don't know how she'd feel about that. Okay, so how was this item edited according to the Y method? So we have two named editors. So they just put on the cover of the book, here are two editors. One of them is Karine Dachi. She does have a PhD in psychology. And she was our most credentialed editor. So two named editors of a book on psychology. What do we think? Okay. Okay, so in fact, the majority here was correct. This book was professionally edited. We don't have any indication specifically that there was peer review. I mean, some things will have like editorial directors, and then they'll say, okay, but it goes through the blind peer review process. We don't have an indication of peer review, so we're going to assume that this was professionally edited. All right, going on to our next question. Okay, so why was this published? What was the publication purpose? And here we're looking at really the audience. So this is the NYU Press, New York University Press. Close to you all, not so close to us. Hey. Can't fool a librarian. So yes, most of you said that it was for higher education purpose. Now I noticed that someone picked nonprofit. I do want to point out when using the Y method that we're really thinking about the audience much of the time, as opposed to whether or not something brought profit, right? Because most higher educational institutions are going to be nonprofit institutions. Similarly, like a lot of the resources that we use that are for a higher education purpose might be done, for instance, by for-profit entities like Wiley. So if something is for that higher ed audience, we consider it a higher ed purpose. So yeah, so that one's a little tricky, but most of you got it. Okay, so now we'll go with some slightly trickier ones. Oh wow, SpongeBob takes the lead. Okay, true or false? This website was quoted in a real student paper that we collected in 2019. It's called the Green Papers. This is where they got their list of Supreme Court justices. It's a political analysis website. Spring of 2019. Okay. Okay, so in fact, most of you were correct. This was really what our student used to talk about the Supreme Court justices, Green Papers. So let's learn about the author of Green Papers and figure out where we think this person fits in this method. Okay, so the author's name is Richard E. Berg Anderson. He's an alumnus of Boston University. He has a degree in music. We don't know if it's a graduate degree or not, just a degree in music, which he says well prepared him for his role as political analyst of the Green Papers. Quote, "It was either that or continuing my career as night manager for a chain of convenience stores." It's appeared in real paper. All right. So what is this person? Let's go see. All right, and again, the majority rules, and the majority was correct. This person is a non-professional. Some of you thought he might have been an academic amateur, and that makes sense because he did mention that he had a professional credential, but we don't know that that's a graduate level credential. So we don't count that as an academic amateur. Like, it really has to be somebody who's like flaunting a PhD or flaunting a master's degree. So this is a classic non-professional. We don't know that this person has professional experience as a journalist, and they've never worked as a political analyst, even though they have managed some chain stores. So yeah. So then finally, Molly's in the lead. Wow, it's constantly changing. So this is our last question from the quiz, or almost our last question. So how was this item edited? And so this is everyone working on the site. We have Richard Berg Anderson is both the editor and also, I suppose, as the writer as well as possibly the editor. There is a webmaster, but there's no indication that that person edits the content. So how do we think that this is edited? Same person who wrote it is the only staff person along with the webmaster. So you were trying to throw you for a loop. Okay. That is correct. This is a self-published piece. He wrote it and he published it, right? He got his buddy, a webmaster, to put together this site for him, and he edits himself, publishes himself. All right. I can see why you'd say it was non-professionally reviewed. That would be true if maybe there were more people listed as working there other than Richard himself. We didn't really consider Tony as somebody who could have served as an editor, but I can see non-professional review is probably the closest. No sense that this was like professionally edited. There's nobody there with editorial expertise or credential in political analysis. So finally, let's see, our last question is why was this published? So the Green Papers, we were blogging before it was cool. So this is clearly a blog that Richard Berg Anderson puts together, established during the previous millennium. So what do we think the purpose might be of the Green Papers? All right. And let's see. There we go. Indeed, this is a personal site that, you know, it's somebody's personal blog. We don't have any evidence that he's getting any money for it. We don't have any evidence that this blog is just for children, even though, you know, that information seemed pretty basic. And we don't have any sense that he has a 501c3 status, which would make him a nonprofit. So with that, I'm going to turn everything over to Frank, and he's going to talk about what happened when we applied this method to some of our own papers. Off to Frank.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share the handout that is available in the chat area, but I'm going to bring it up on my screen so that you can see it up on your own particular screens while I go through it and talk about the data. Being an academic, I was very interested in this, in participating in this study, and it lent itself well to a lot of analysis, especially I have a bit of a background in bibliometrics, and so working with references and that sort of thing, this study really appealed to me. But aside from a purely academic perspective, I believe too that using the why method is a great way of performing self-assessment of instructional strategies related to improving information literacy in schools and universities. On the handout here, which I hope everyone can see, I do have a little bit of background information about the universities. that we collected the data from. The three universities, one was a doctoral professional university according to the Carnegie classification of institutions of higher education, and the other two were larger master's colleges and universities. So we have a somewhat diverse group of universities from where we could pull our data. From the 30 papers that we used for this particular presentation, originally at ALA and that we're doing here now, we were able to pull 308 references from those 30 papers, so just over 10 references per paper on average, with Midwest University being the largest contributor to all of this. Now, you may wonder, why did we choose papers specifically from English composition classes? And the main reason is because of the incredible variety of topics that students can choose to write on for this particular assignment for English composition. The topics range from strictly academic to topics of popular culture, focusing on media, personalities, etc. There was no limit of the different types of topics that were looked at or written about in these papers. And really, the variety of topics can actually help demonstrate and confirm the robustness of using the Y method for classifying references. And also, at the same time, it helps you remember too that the resources used in the construction of these types of papers are contextual in relation to the chosen topic, which I'll discuss a little bit more later. So a variety of different characteristics about the papers and the students from where we drew these papers. Really, the only thing I want to kind of bring to your attention is that females as a group tended to have a significantly higher GPA than males. I don't know what this means, but it's something certainly to explore further, perhaps in further research. Just let me minimize this a little bit so I can get everything on here that I want to talk about. There we go. The first thing I wanted to talk about briefly was what types of resources are students using. Nearly 75% of all of the resources that we classified used only 8 attribute combinations. Just for comparison's sake, we did publish a similar paper back actually it was earlier this year in college and research libraries. It was a pilot study that used papers only from one university. And in that particular case, there were 14 different combinations used to cover roughly 75% of the references as well. Whereas in this study, where it's a slightly smaller sample, about 75% of all of the references came from these 8 particular combinations. Of course, I think what is most desirable that we want to look at are these first 2 attribute combinations. So this first type, these are resources that have been written by an academic professional, that have undergone peer review and are published for the purposes of higher education. And we also have resources written by a professional or journalist that have gone some sort of professional editing review and that have been published for commercial purposes. Those 2 alone account for over 50% of all of the references. So I think we can, not relax a bit, sure, but at least know that our efforts in terms of trying to communicate to students the value of undergoing some sort of review of the authoritativeness of resources does seem to be bearing fruit. Of course, there are some anomalies, or there are some other types of resources being used, but that's okay again, especially when you consider the contextualization of resources as it pertains to a topic. The other thing too, that these professional or journalists written resources that have undergone professional editing and that are published for commercial purposes, I think too, something like this with having nearly 18% of those references coming from these types of resources is some type of reflection of the contemporaneousness of topics, where you need a resource that is much more current, that you can that students have used, and so it's still it's almost like using a primary resource, but a recent one in that case. But I would suggest too that perhaps with these types of resources, that CRAAP, currency, relevance, accuracy, authority, and purpose of sources, might be applied in some instances for source evaluation to consider possible bias. Our particular approach is very objective. It's non-value based, whereas CRAAP may be considered value based, but still it does have a purpose here that is definitely worth considering. Moving on, and I'm going to minimize this a bit more, so I hope I can get all three. I hope everyone can see this still. Besides looking at all of the resources, we also broke up the different types of attributes based on author identity, editorial process, and publication purpose. What I find really interesting, especially for these last two tables, is that over 80% of the resources used were either professionally edited or underwent peer review. And in terms of publication purpose, over 80% were published for the purposes of higher education or commercial purposes. So again, we're seeing a really strong concentration of resources that are quite authoritative. And even again, if we look at author identity, there's three particular attributes of these resources that really stand out. That being, they tend to be written by academic professionals or journalists or non-professionals. So again, we're starting to see a lot of concentration in terms of who are writing these resources that are being used in these papers. And again, I think the nice thing about doing this sort of analysis is you can see where students are trending in terms of the construction of these papers. You could substitute English composition papers for history papers or political science papers or social studies papers and do the same sort of analysis. And then you can point certain things out either to teachers, university instructors, college instructors, to show them what seems to be going on with the papers that are being presented or being written and submitted. And you can show them how these trends are going, and perhaps if they feel the need, or if you feel the need in your instruction, you can make adjustments accordingly to help students in the construction of their research papers. And finally, we compared how these papers were broken down by university, so and by the individual attributes. So for example, in this first chart here, I'll just increase the size of this a bit. So this is for author identity. And what we see here is, for example, the university that we call Pacific Coast University, the overwhelming number of references ended up using resources written by academic professionals. And then in the other two universities, so we see a slightly more balanced use of resources written by different types of authors. For example, Midwestern University had predominantly more professional, or not predominantly more, but they had more professional or journalist writers for the resources used in those same papers. We can do the same thing too when we look at the H attribute of the Y method, editorial process. Midwestern University, their students use many more professionally edited resources, whereas Pacific Coast University use many more peer-reviewed types of resources. And the same can also be examined for the final attribute of the Y method, which is the publication purpose. And again, we're starting to see some of the same trends that were reflected in the other attributes also reflected in here as well. Again, Pacific Coast University, many more higher education, and then Midwest University, commercial, they use predominantly commercially published resources. It hasn't said much about the Southeastern University, but they're pretty balanced, more balanced, a little more balanced across the board than the other two universities. That being said, I just want to conclude on a couple of things that no one institution students, or actually no one class's students are the same in terms of their perception and construction of authority. And this could be due to past experience, the availability of certain information resource tools, or even the type of instruction at various at their respective institutions that they've attended. I think context really needs to be considered by instructors and instructional librarians. What are the best resources for the topic chosen by the student? If the paper's topic is related to popular music, for example, would instructors or librarians expect that all information resources related to the topic would be written by academic professionals and published in peer-reviewed academic journals? So as a result, the choice of appropriate information resources is definitely situational and contextual. So with that, I'm going to now turn over the presentation to James, who will wrap things up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank. And thank you. A couple of folks have already posted some questions and comments in the chat. Please do keep doing that, since we'll address questions here at the end. I'm going to conclude by just talking briefly about a couple of instruction activities. What Frank was just talking about, we imagine would be very relevant to many of you thinking about comparisons between like high school authors and collegiate authors, or between maybe different campuses. I know we've got a lot of different folks listening today, and we're hoping this is going to be relevant no matter where you are in library land. I'm going to talk though about instruction. I know many of us are engaged in instruction. And thinking about instruction, not just as a librarian instructor, although I do a lot of that in my job, but my background is also as a high school language arts teacher. I teach some freshman experience courses here. And so a couple of ideas for how you might make this practical. And again, there are links in the chat. The first assignment I put together just as an example for you, it's a word handout that asks students to say, okay, imagine you've got 6 different authors. So it's focused just on author identity. Let's look at their credentials and think about when you would or wouldn't use them. And in this case, it's about basketball. And so it's a range from somebody who anonymously blogs about basketball online all the way up to a former All-American college point guard and someone who's got a PhD in sports history. The idea behind the handout is that it doesn't require any internet access. I remember being a high school teacher and having a very difficult time getting into labs and getting labs where all the equipment worked the way I wanted. And so I wanted to show you an example of how to use the method in a way that doesn't require you to have access to the internet at all. It asks students to look at these 6 authors and ask themselves, okay, if I was writing an opinion piece on whether or not LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time, which of them would I trust? Like, who would I trust and who wouldn't I trust? What if I was writing a research paper on whether or not college athletes should be paid for their work? Who would I trust? Who wouldn't I trust? And then there are some questions that just ask students to reflect on, okay, why do I trust the people I trust? To me, this is something that wouldn't just be a worksheet. It would spark a conversation, because I'd want to get a discussion going with students about just the question of what kinds of expertise matter. You'll notice that our system doesn't provide scores. It doesn't designate like what a good source or a bad source is. It's very intentional on our part. The original taxonomy did create the sort of numeric readout at the end. And that's not something we were interested in. It seems to us that it's really worthwhile to have a conversation about whether the person with the PhD in sports history is a more appropriate expert than a former college athlete when we're talking about college athletics. They have different perspectives and they have different kinds of authority. Even just in the activity that Mary led, right? Probably many of you at the end of one of those questions thought, well, hold on now, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. That's great. That's exactly the reaction we want. We think that that kind of really conscious critical engagement with sources is a wonderful habit of mind to develop for students. And then an assignment like this could help you do that. And certainly I would expect that in a conversation about, okay, which of the authors would we trust, we would start to drift towards the fact that we need to think about the other questions, right? Is this sports historian writing for some sort of formal publication, or am I just reading this person's personal blog? Is this All-American point guard writing for a major professional outlet, CNN or Sports Illustrated or what have you? Or is this something that appeared, on, I don't know, some sort of a sports wiki they help moderate or something like that? There's lots of different pathways for information to reach us, and thinking about the stages in that pathway we think is really important. The other link that we've given you is a link to a Google form assignment. So in a classroom where it's wired, or you've got access to a computer lab, set of Chromebooks, bring your own device, whatever your approach is, asking students to take a source that they've found. This would be very practical. take a source that they've found that they're thinking of using for their upcoming assignment, but they're not quite sure whether or not it's a good source to use. And ask them to walk through, okay, how would they classify the source in these 3 questions for the why method, and explaining why they think so. Frank was right, I think, to point out that there is a sort of reassurance to realize, yeah, the vast majority of or at least the bulk of what students are producing is sort of familiar looking sources. But there's another way of seeing that, right? Which is to say that half of the sources are academic peer-reviewed journal articles and professional edited commercial, like New York Times articles, CNN. That's mostly what that second category is. The other thing to remember, though, is that means that half of our articles, right, the long tail here of all the different kinds of strange sources you might find, especially on the internet, that makes up half of the bibliographic information we're looking at. It's almost every single author we're looking at here. Some student authors relied much more on traditional academic material than others, but almost every single one of them has something that's a little bit quirky. Even if it's just an article that is a peer-reviewed journal article, but it's from a journal that's quite unfamiliar to you. You're having a hard time finding information about it. You can't find any information about the authors, and you're starting to wonder whether or not these are people who even have academic credentials. You know, helping students to recognize that it's not as simple as just finding some quick label and assuming, oh, that's a good source, I'm going to move on. We think is a really valuable sort of conversation to start with students and to engage in, because for us, right, as information professionals, it's easy to rely on these labels to say, oh, well, you need to use peer-reviewed articles. Until we had engaged in this work over these last few years, I'll just speak on behalf of my research partners here. I don't think any of us had thought as critically about this as we should have. And we, in conversation with each other about these sources, raised a lot of questions about what the world of scholarly publishing is like right now, and whether the advice we're accustomed to giving students is really the best advice we can give them. That kind of thinking and that kind of wondering and discovery, we think, is a good part of using this sort of approach. Well, we wanted to leave about 20 minutes here at the end for questions, and so that's what we've got. There is a chat there that we hope will make things easy. And if I scroll back up, I think the very first question that showed up was a question from Molly, who asked us whether or not we collected any of the assignment source type requirements. And since I guess I'm talking, I'll go ahead and I guess I'll just answer that. We did, not for the pilot. So the piece that appeared in CNRL in April didn't talk about that because we didn't get that initially. We did collect syllabi and assignments when instructors have much of a description of what their assignment is. And so we have that material for the data we collected this spring. We're really interested in looking at that, but I'll admit, I don't know that we've thought yet about how to do that. Like what we'd even be looking at or how we'd try to classify assignment instructions in the way that we've tried to classify and understand student sources. But I don't know if Frank or Mary has anything to add about that. What else do we have out here? Dave likes your comment, Frank, so that's a good thing.
I appreciate it. I send in my thanks. James, I just want to add one little thing, if I may, please. The first table I showed that showed all the you know, how 8 different attribute combinations accounted for 75% of the resources that we classified. That's 8 attribute combinations out of a possible 343 combinations, right? So, you know, 7 to the power 3, really. So again, though, it does show that great concentration in those particular attributes. And we are working on our next paper using these data and from these particular English composition papers. So we'll see how that changes, especially as because we will be using a larger sample. But still, it's rather incredible to see this incredible concentration, and so it'll be interesting to see how things change if they do at all.
Well, while we're waiting for another question, I don't know, Mary, you and I go back and forth over these things all the time. Mary and I are in the midst of scoring a much larger pool of data from the papers we collected this spring, and we have had a lot of conversation.
It looks like James froze.
James froze.
No,
No, we didn't.
We'll come back to us.
Hopefully it didn't happen over here.
I'll send him a quick text just in case.
Sounds good. All right, yeah. In the meantime, we have another question coming in.
Oh, James is coming back as soon as he can. His computer crashed.
Oh no.
All right. Hi, it's the Southeastern Conference Room. We have a question for. Go ahead. Yeah, the speaker's over there.
Hi, my question is, have you completely replaced like the CRAAP tests with the Y? And do you find that it does the job just as well, you think? Or I deal mostly with high school students, so that, their main focus is, why can't we use Google for searching instead of databases? And the CRAAP tests, encompasses a lot, but how do you find with the Ys that you find that works just as well?
So I do a little more teaching than Frank does. As the humanities librarian at Northeastern, I teach English 102 students, right? So a lot of these tend to be like traditionally aged students. They're often freshmen, some sophomores. And I have been using elements of the Y method in class instead of CRAAP. And to be honest with you, I am sort of going, how can I put this? I'm sort of like trying to take the conversation. What this has done is it's helped me kind of take the conversation beyond like, why shouldn't I use Google? Because what we're finding is that students are going to be interacting with Google no matter what we want from them. So instead, we just want them to be better consumers about like what they might find there, and sort of understand what is the purpose of academic research, like in the context of the work that they're going to be doing. I wish James were on. So he was at the Pacific Coast University where students do almost exclusively work in academic journals. And sometimes what we found is that maybe students' knowledge of a topic, or maybe their vocabulary is not quite yet ready to deal exclusively in like peer-reviewed journal articles, if that makes any sense. So basically I found that the Y method has been really helpful in more just talking about like how do I decide like what to trust, whether, not worrying so much about like where it came from, like whether it's from Google or from a database, but more just looking at the resource itself, regardless of the format. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question?
One thing too, I don't think I personally have never really said to my students who work in my classes, because of course I prepare librarians to join your ranks, your professional ranks. I personally don't have a problem with them using Google to find information resources, especially more and more authoritative information resources are finding their way online. You look at the growing number of freely available journals that are being published online, but I think what really matters most is that once a student finds an information resource, regardless of whether it's a journal database or if it's just online through Google or Bing or whatever, that they go through some sort of process of evaluation of the resource, be it through Y, CRAAP, whatever, and that it is a good information resource. And I think that's part of what we need to kind of really instill in people, not only just students, but people in general, is this indeed a good resource? Here are certain criteria you should look for and evaluate the resource accordingly. So I'm not as concerned as I'm not as concerned about the medium through which the individual has obtained the information. I'm more concerned about the particular tool that the individual has used to assess the information that they have retrieved or found regardless of the medium through which they have found it. But that's just my own personal perspective. Maybe I'm the anarchist of the group. I don't know. Am I?
Yes, you are, Frank.
Yeah, we got a follow-up
Oh,
question.
hi, thank you. The reason why I framed it that way is because a lot of our English teachers will come to the library and require us to show the students just the databases. Like, they don't want them to use anything else. So I think that's why I phrased it that way, because hearing what you're saying now frees me up to say to the teachers, okay, you know, we can use a little bit more. It's not just the databases, and it gives me an opportunity to broaden the instruction, because a lot of times I don't get that much time with high school teachers.
I agree. And how many people here use Google's advanced search features? You know, I mean, I will agree they're not the best. They're not as structured. They don't have as much metadata to work with as do our journal databases. But I mean, you can really construct very good and precise searches using Google's advanced search, for example. So, you know, again, it's you know, I'm not. And you know, even Wikipedia, I know that Wikipedia seems to be a bad word in our profession and in our discipline, but we do have the research published in our discipline that shows Wikipedia resources are not all bad, for lack of a better word. But again, I think a lot of people, they don't treat Wikipedia for what it is. And I consider Wikipedia to be a reference source. I don't consider it to be the end all and be all as an information resource, but if you treat it like you would treat Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, and then build on that as an initial point of doing your information research, then I think it certainly serves its purpose.
And could I just jump in with one more thing about this process in the classroom as opposed to the CRAAP test? I do personally find it's really liberating not to try to talk about bias in the classroom. I obviously have my own political viewpoints and I have my own biases. And when I'm in the classroom, one of the things that's great about working with the Y method is that, you know, somebody's either credentialed or they're not. They're either following a rigorous editorial process or they're not. Their purpose is either nonprofit or academic or, right? And so what that means is that when a student is maybe creating a paper, they can see that, you know what, there are some very conservative news media outlets that have actually pretty high, you know, pretty highly qualified people writing for them. There are some liberal media outlets that have some pretty highly qualified people writing for them, right? And I think that when they are engaging with different viewpoints, I think that what I want is I want to see them like engaging with the most credentialed or the most authoritative sources with those viewpoints. So personally, I actually like not talking about assessing bias in the classroom. In some ways, it's what I do as a librarian, right? I pick all kinds of resources with different kinds of viewpoints, but that meet a certain standard of quality.
Yeah. To follow up on that, and my apologies for disappearing. I saw the blue screen of death for the first time in many months. I don't know where it came from. My computer knows I'm doing a webinar. Molly asked the question whether or not we've done a comparison between CRAAP Talk classes and Y Talk classes. We haven't yet. It's a really good question. Part of our challenge with figuring out how to evaluate that is we would almost certainly use the Y method to evaluate. Because it is tested now by research, both by Leader Marquis-Nico and by us. And we feel like we've achieved the right level of reliability, that it does provide a sort of repeatable score in a way that the CRAAP test just has never really been tested. But it would still be really interesting to look at how students use sources and how their source use changes depending on how we go about teaching them about it. I think it's a great question. And K Patinodes, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm saying your name wrong. You mentioned that like something to post to teachers unless students are in school databases are only available in libraries. Students outside of school be using popular search engines. We completely agree. And that's one of the things that we think is really important, is that at some point in the high school and college experience, we have got to be giving them advice that is relatable to their real world information needs and searches. Because I can't count the number of times I'm talking to seniors right, in my education program who are saying, well, wait a minute, how are we going to find this or that if we don't have access to this database? And sometimes I can point them to freely available sources, but so often we don't. And I think it really is important for us to have, whether it's this method or not. For us, we really feel convicted about this method. You all are going to be drawing your own conclusions, I think, but at the very least, I think we have to agree that we've got to communicate to students, and not just us, but their instructors have to communicate to them a way of thinking about information that works in the real world. Oh, Molly, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So just to kind of follow up with this, I wondered too about if you had started reaching out to faculty, because I find with faculty where I teach, you know, some of them are very much in this hard line of like only academic resources, and I'm not saying that I would change their minds, but and then some of them are much more flexible. So you know, I'm also, I have an information literacy course and I have non-librarians teaching it. So also, like, if you guys started having dialogues with non-librarians about this way of looking at information and if that sort of influenced the resources that they accept for their papers, or I feel like sometimes the professors are just sort of checking off these boxes, like I want 3 peer-reviewed articles, I need it from this database, you know, and so I wondered if you guys had started having any dialogue with, you know, non-librarians, other professors about the sources that they require or things like that.
I can speak for myself here. I'll be presenting next week to our information literacy instructors and some other our English composition instructors and some other English comp faculty from the area. There's a meetup very similar to the one you're having in Southeastern New York today for librarians and English comp instructors here locally. And so it's something that I'll be sharing directly with that audience and hoping to get some engagement. For us, English Comp is taught by mostly our master's students. And so I have some hope of being able to get some purchase there just because I've got a lot of instructors every year who are brand new. And so they don't have that sort of, the thing that develops for all of us as teachers, right? Where we know what we know. Because I've approached instructors here and I've said, hey, you know, this thing that you do the CRAAP test for, could we try this new method of ours? And there is this sort of, let's just sort of go with the tried and true this year, you know, maybe next year. And so I think that we're finding the same inertia, at least I'm finding the same inertia you would expect. I'm hoping that being able to share some data is going to help change the conversation, but we'll see.
And this is really new. I mean, we made this handout in the last few weeks. I mean, you know, I mean, this really is new research and sort of a new way of thinking. I mean, we've been thinking about this for a while for our research because this is a great way of evaluating programs and evaluating, you know, student results. But in terms of like, you know, the opportunities for the classroom, I'd say we're just really starting to get the word out.
And what I'm hoping to have as a conversation is I'm looking at students who are like citing, you know, they're writing a paper about a fairly mundane health topic, and they are citing the most arcane, you know, niche peer-reviewed journal articles. You know, they want to, you know, give evidence that they know that, I don't know, anesthesia works, and they're citing some ridiculously precise anesthesia peer-reviewed journal article. This is not an article they have read or understood, right? Figuring out how to have that conversation with faculty, that the goal here is not to pile up a really impressive list of academic sources necessarily. That's a harder conversation to have, right? Because it treads out of our expertise into theirs as composition faculty or in whatever discipline. But I think it's important because I think we've gotten into the habit of just telling them, don't use this, do use this. And yeah, we have successfully beaten into them that they shouldn't use Wikipedia. It almost never shows up in bibliographies. And we have successfully herded at least a lot of them into using those academic peer-reviewed sources, right? It was by far the most cited attribute combination we saw. But if you look at those articles and then look at how they're actually used in the paper. And that is yet another layer of research here we want to do. We have the text of their papers to be able to compare to the bibliography. Our feeling is that much of the time students are not using those sources well. Students aren't really ready to use those sources well. And we need to have a conversation about what kind of information is even appropriate to use for the sorts of tasks we're asking to perform.
Mhm.
All right, so we've got about 1 minute left. Is there anything else that you guys saw come up in the chat that we haven't addressed yet? If anyone's question got buried, you can feel free to unmute yourself and just kind of let us know.
Mary already responded to Molly's question about point about bias, but it's an excellent point. Yeah.
While we're waiting to see if anything else comes up, Mary, Frank, and James, do you want to let us know where we could reach you if we have follow-up questions, or if anyone wants to get in touch?
My personal, my work email is very simple. It's frank.lambert@mtsu.edu. Our MLS program is 100% online, so I'm very well trained in responding quickly.
That's good. And I've just dropped into the chat. There's a link to a LibGuide that we originally built for our ALA presentation in June, and we've added to for this presentation today. It's got contact info and links to our articles and all those things if you want to spend a little time looking a little more deeply.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
This is great.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's great. It's like applause, virtual applause. Regular applause. Over here.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone who's able to join us today. Presenters will stay on the line with you in just a minute. And everyone else have a great day, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Bye.